Hi, Liz.
Hi, Agnes.
So, over the summer, you wrote this piece in which you interviewed a man named Francis. You don't give his last name,
Yeah.
about who had been sexually abused by the former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. And at some point, you're like sitting next to him
Mhm.
in church, I think, and he says to you, faith is really hard to do solo.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that? And if so, why is it hard to do solo?
I do think that's true. I think there are a number of reasons. I think for Francis, speaking in a specifically, so there are different ways to think about what faith is. So in the Catholic context, the actual practice of the religion, the sacraments, and the belief are not so distinct. In Protestantism, which is what I was raised in, the belief, the sort of interior state, is totally distinct from the practice of the religion. So, you know, theoretically, you could be alone on a desert island and be a fully practicing Methodist or whatever. You just have the thoughts in your head and operate according to a certain ethics. But it's difficult to do that as a Catholic, and much is made of this, especially in early church literature. And so, that's sort of the easy way out of answering that question. The more difficult way is to say, well, even if you believe, if the entire world is either completely indifferent to that state or especially hostile to it, then it becomes very, very difficult to maintain not only the outward practice but the belief itself. Not that it's impossible; people do it, but that's hard, and it's much easier if part of that cognitive burden can be outsourced. People don't have faith and then lose it strictly, right? They have it and lose it all the time. It sort of fluctuates, which I find normal. And in those fluctuations, it's very useful to have other people who can reaffirm, what you need reaffirmed for you, I think.
Do you think it's partly that, like, I feel like when I am um, like completely outside of a religious context and religious connection with other people, I I question my own faith more. Like I feel myself asking myself, like, do I really believe? Do I really believe in God? Like, that's a question even though I do believe, I also struggle very much with belief. And like, for some reason, it seems like other people make it possible not to ask oneself that question. That's my experience, but I don't know why it comes up less if there's other people.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is, there's something in us, very social creatures that we do question what we're up to less if everyone's up to it, for better or worse. Um, but I have kind of the opposite situation where, I mean, I might just, have that. Well, it's not really a Protestant impulse as much as like a mystical one, where I'm most religious when I'm like completely by myself, having some sort of transcendent ex- experience of God, which has happened a couple times, a few times. And then every other time when I'm receiving the sacraments, or I'm just thinking about those times,
Hmm.
and they sort of endure. Um, but having other people around makes the practice a lot easier because if you post a picture of yourself, if I do a selfie this Friday eating a burger, people are gonna be like, "It's Lent, bitch." Right? So other people sort of hold you to your practice. And that's helpful. I find that really helpful. And because in Catholicism, so much of the practice is actually bound up in the belief, in the interior state, I find that to be helpful in the end as well.
Let me take a step back and introduce ourselves. Hi, everyone. I'm Agnes Callard. I am a philosopher and I teach at the University of Chicago, and I started Night Owls a couple of years ago. Liz, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Liz Bruenig. I am a Twitter user and I write for the New York Times. Um, and that's about it. Yeah.
Tyler, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Tyler Zimmer. I'm a philosopher. I teach at East Chicago, and I'll be helping to facilitate the Q&A. And so I just want to encourage everybody to use the ask a question function below if you have a question, because our speakers will answer them later in the event.
Yeah. Also, by the way, you guys are being oh, I didn't scroll down. Okay, you're pretty quiet in the chat, but like, you can talk amongst yourselves while we talk. We won't necessarily reply, but then sometimes those develop into really good questions in the Q&A. So, but yeah, put your questions in the Q&A. We're gonna talk for about like 40 more minutes, and then we will open it up. Okay, I want to ask you about interviewing. So you did this, you talked to this man about like a subject that's very intimate and also painful for him. And he's a stranger, like you don't know him.
Yeah.
How do you do that? Do you like talking to strangers? And how do you, for me, I was thinking about this for the first time. I was like imagining being you and having to like talk to strangers and call them on the phone. And I was like, this is my worst nightmare. So how do you manage that part of your job?
Yeah. So there are like two components to it. There's like the subjective experience of it, and then there's the sort of techne, like how do you get someone to talk to you about those things? And even if you're like fully prepared, that's still like you form your methods of communicating with people into like a craft that's designed to encourage and provoke those kinds of statements and disclosures that people would not normally make, to a total stranger, much less one who's writing for a major media outlet. So, to divide it into those two parts, when I was a little kid, I was thinking about this today. I had doll houses, and I really liked them, but I didn't play with them, which was probably an early sign that something wasn't quite right. But I liked to look in them and see what I could try to deduce or tell myself a story about the people who lived in them and their lives, their worlds, right? So you're looking in like a Victorian dollhouse and you're thinking, okay, though there's no servants' quarters, so they must be sort of bourgeois, petit bourgeois. So this is probably a nuclear family unit, therefore, maybe urban townhouse types, and so you're trying to tell yourself a story. I love doing that. I could do it for hours just in complete silence. I also would do that with our Christmas tree. I would look inside of it as a much younger kid and imagine like a world for fairies or creatures. And that is the instinct that makes it possible for me to, I think, interview so broadly, is because in some sense, I'm still like a very small kid looking through a hole into someone else's life and their world. And I love that aspect of it. I wish that I could have a confessional booth and just sit on one side of a grate and have people come in and just tell me things about what's going on with them. And oftentimes when I'm in those conversations, because there are elements that are very uncomfortable, like prodding people to disclose things that are uncomfortable or difficult for them, that maybe they've never put into words before. So I interviewed one fellow about childhood sexual abuse in the Catholic Church who had never even told his mother what happened. Right now,
Right, that was in the piece.
Yeah, and there was a second case like that, the McCutcheon case, which ran in the Washington Post when I was there, and I actually had the police files, which were not supposed to be released to me, but because they were so old, typically you can't get incident reports or anything having to do with a case where the victim was a juvenile. It was usually sealed. But because this case was so old, I just went to the courthouse in PG County and like asked for it on microfiche, and they were like, "Yeah, whatever, get out of here." So I actually had the complete police report, so I was actually able to probe in a way that other people had not been able to, and that is excruciating. You're asking these questions, people are rightly kind of disturbed. How do you know that? How did you find that out? And they're trying to figure out what kind of judgments you're making of them based on that. And it's horrible emotionally to be in that position. I just have a persona that I adopt that's not me, right? And I just kind of dissociate from the situation. I'm taking notes, and I've usually got a recorder going, and I just kind of exit the situation, and I know professionally what I need to do, and I find it very difficult to do. And so, it's funny that you pick Citizen Kane, because my sort of idealized image of a journalist is a very noir image, right? Because the journalists, there are a couple of reasons. For one, detectives get to do exactly what I always liked to do as a kid, which is look at people's lives through a hole. And I would have liked to have been a detective, save that I actually don't want to prosecute anyone. I just want to know. And in noir, at that point in time, not only are noir stories often detective stories, but there's usually a journalist involved. And they were much more similar to sort of extrajudicial detectives at that point, in that it was not a professionalized industry. These were not, nice college educated people with the right political opinions. These were very morally ambiguous figures in a lot of ways, like the classic detectives of classic detective fiction. And I identify very strongly with that. And I like that figure as a self-aware, probably leaning more to good, but understanding that there's a significant dark they do. And that's typically the persona that I'm adopting. I'm thinking about that kind of figure. The other thing is, getting people to talk to you. And the the thing that I rely on is just complete and total self-disclosure. If you, I think Zizek said something like that at one point about just instantly revealing his id to people when he meets them. And that's a great way to bond really quickly. But, you look at the Marines or whatever, or any situation where there's a severe sort of ego destruction period laid down, where everybody is being just decimated at the same time together. And it's not for the benefit of the drill sergeant, it's for the benefit of the people, because they all end up totally revealing themselves, id and all, to each other, which forms this very, very, very intense bond. But you can also just do that conversationally. So I will tell people things about myself in our conversations that perhaps help them to understand my interest and experiences a bit, that are very, very transparent. Yeah.
So it's really interesting because I feel like you said two things. You said, on the one hand, I withdraw and I hold myself at a distance and I have this persona and it's not the real me. And then on the other hand, you said, well, I bond with people and I show them my id and I reveal everything about myself.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile those two pictures that you've just presented of yourself?
So the interview process, especially where you're dealing with difficult cases that have difficult questions like these, are long. And so oftentimes you're doing that preliminary or first stage reporting interview, where you're getting the details on the record. That's the really uncomfortable part, because you're still, virtually strangers. And, at that point, I in the conversation itself, I'm, just kind of going by these professional cues I know. And that's the kind of persona element of it. And then there's a third phase of the reporting process, where you're really just getting past the sort of specific narrative details and into the person's subjective experience of the thing. How did you feel? Well, do you think this had anything to do with that? later in your life, et cetera, et cetera. That is the point where I am just, the conversations are not 5 minutes of me asking questions and 45 minutes of them answering. It's just a conversation. I mean, it's about half and half with me kind of disclosing, and that keeps the conversation moving along. And so I think it kind of, on some level, it's just not reconciled. It's just a note of dissonance in the whole process, or at least the way I practice it. But if there were to be an argument that it can be reconciled, I think it would have to do with that chronology.
Do you see journalism as a form of advocacy, or how does advocacy fit into and journalism understood broadly?
It can be.
I mean, for you in particular.
Oh, well, no. I mean, that's why I'm not a great journalist, right? Is because, you get into the opinion journalism game typically because you have some drum to beat. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a very good thing, and it needs to be done, especially in the context of a liberal democracy, is you'll very frequently be reminded by journalists. I have very few drums to beat, honestly. I'm amazed that people can write an opinion column every week or even two, because I don't have like 6 opinions a year. Like, I have sort of like thoughts. I don't have that many thoughts that I would try to compel other people to believe. Right? Because shit, I don't know, 30 years old now, thinking about it still. And that's the things that I would want other people to, maybe compel them to believe. You probably know that I'm Catholic and that I'm a socialist. And there's really only so much, drum beating there you can do. So then after that, it's like, well, how do I convince these people to keep letting me write? Because what I'm really interested in is just the human experience, right? What it's like to be a person, especially people in extremis. So, the advocacy part of it factors in that oftentimes what has happened to people that is interesting, that is important, there is a part of it that requires advocacy, Now, I'm very attracted to lost causes, which is a problem. But the way people cope with those is really interesting to me. So there's an advocacy piece. For me, it's less about, I would say, sort of like broad, overarching advocacy, and more about sort of individual spots of advocacy as they relate to, suffering and evil, and, those being the kind of subject that I'm interested in. Those end up being the things that I focus on.
Suppose journalism just was put on pause, like worldwide, for like 3 weeks or something, right? So for 3 weeks there was just zero journalism. What would happen? Like what? Yeah.
Well, there's an instinct I have to answer that question by avoiding it, which is saying, well, journalism's a lot less essential than it once was, precisely because people can share information with each other so quickly on social media. So you look at any mass shooting, etc. Some of the best reporting from those is just people who are there filming. And journalists who are like listening to police scanners or talking to cops or trying to locate someone in the area, they often have totally incorrect information. Almost always comes out later to have been wrong in some kind of way. But just like a guy standing there with his phone filming, what you see is what you get. And, if that were still around, some people call it citizen journalism, and it's indistinguishable from just a lot of social media use. But I think we've seen through the protests last year and, other major news events that's actually very, very effective. I mean, who reported out the Capitol riots? They did. The people who were rioting, they were the reporters covering their own riot, because it wasn't just a riot. It was an action that was meant to be visible all along. That's why they took their phones and recorded and broadcasted, because it was a performance of some kind, which doesn't mean it's not real. It just means it's something that you were meant to see. And, so if that all persisted, probably not too much would change. But, there is still use in journalists kind of pulling back and putting together top level stuff. So like it is important actually to disseminate data, right? So like high level data, you need to be able to get CDC numbers out to a huge amount of people to understand what the coronavirus looks like, not only in your house, but in your whole geographical region. That's very important. And to the degree that people would have less information to make decisions with about stuff like that, I would think that would be a very serious problem. And then there are particular points in time, elections, etc., where investigations that journalists do become extremely important as well. Citizen journalists don't necessarily have a ton of access or the capacity or knowledge and skill to file a bunch of FOIA requests, get a bunch of people on the phone and start putting together this larger story. That's a very important function, that investigatory function. And more vital during certain periods than others. So yeah, I mean, I think on the whole, probably the answer is, you probably wouldn't see any instantaneous dramatic changes, total shutdown of society stuff, but you would probably see people lose the capacity, lose information that they were using previously to make certain judgments, which could have, would certainly make them less free. I don't know. I find that hard to understand. It would make their decisions less informed, let's say, less culpable. No.
I want to ask you something about the New York Times. Tell me, this is my experience, tell me whether you think it's right. I feel like over the past year, maybe 2 years, there's been more of a tendency to attribute views to the New York Times. Like something I wrote over the summer, a bunch of people described it as the New York Times says, right? Mm-hmm. And I was like, that's weird because I said it, and I feel like it's not just a question of does it have a political slant, because I think lots of publications that have a way more obvious political slant than the New York Times don't get this. I feel like somehow the New York Times has become like what Hobbes called a person, namely like an entity that is not like a human being, but has like mental states attributed to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And does that seem right to you? And why did this happen?
Yes. I think it's part of a very long process. I think, it's fair to call it an institution. It's certainly because of, Ben Smith recently pointed out this sort of the monopoly on prestige and so on. And, things are moving in that direction more and more, but monopoly even on space and reach, it is an institution, and it becomes an organ in our society, whether anyone likes it or not. And anytime you have an institution where, especially Americans feel unaccountable and unelected power is being exerted over them, they're going to, I think, personify that institution. So you definitely see that with all of the, the organs of government. So, you can get statements like, Supreme Court sucks. This court sucks, right? This court hates XYZ. This court hates, and you see that no matter what the dispensation is. And I think, the New York Times is one of those organs. Now, there's no need to say it, but it's obviously true that internally there are all kinds, as balkanized as anything else. There are people with wildly different views on things. And so every time I see someone say, or even when I encounter people in public, my family's mostly conservative, and they'll say, liberal, you're a liberal, you write for the liberal New York Times. I'm like, I'm very ambivalent about the whole liberal philosophy, honestly. I always tell my parents I have more problems with liberalism than you do. And there's a deliberate slippage in the types, in the usage of the word there. But, there's also some truth to it. And that, in terms of the kind of greater American project, I probably have more questions than my folks.
Well, I want to ask you about liberalism. This week I happened to be reading for the first time Mill's Subjection of Women, which is great. And there's this wonderful discussion in it about power. And what he says there is that people seek power. Essentially, he's trying to explain why women can be so like manipulative and terrible, right? And he's like, the reason why they do this is because they're subjected to men, and they have to like use whatever tricks and resources are in their disposal. They have to go for power because they don't have liberty. And that what I thought was so interesting there is I'd never seen liberty and power pitted up against one another like that. That in effect, the quest for power and the interest in power is really a sign of the deprivation of liberty. So people who want power, who feel like they need power, feel like they lack power, what that means is they don't have liberty. Do you think that's right? And I have some other questions about that, but I'm just interested to hear your take on it.
So my gut feeling would be, can be the case. People, in the American tradition who are looking for liberty tend to be pretty upfront about that. And in fact, they tend to deny that they're interested in power. So you think about they seem to kind of be telling the truth at times. I mean, I don't believe Randy Weaver was going to ever evangelize or try to compel the rest of us to do anything in particular. I think that guy just wanted to live on a hilltop in Idaho in a cabin with his family and, hoard guns and, hang out. And then the FBI went and picked a fight with him, and that's, I think he is a good example of like the kind of American libertarian spirit where there's a total denial of any interest in power. And the only power that's being sought in this case, the firearms, is to defend this small amount of liberty that has been secured, in the form of property. I think you see a lot of that. On the other hand, I think, well, let me put it this way. There's a point where liberty and power are basically indistinguishable, because liberty exists insofar as it's exercised. And the exercise of liberty is going to be identical to the exercise of power. So like when both of those potentials are deployed, they are deployed in the same form, it seems to me. And therefore both of those thirsts are infinite. Right. So,
Yeah, I mean, here's one way I thought of framing it. And I don't know if this is right or not, but you might think, I've always thought like, well, socialists say are more interested in equality, whereas I was over and against liberty or something like that. But you might think, no, the fundamental goal isn't equality. The fundamental goal of the socialists could be understood also as liberty, but that in a situation of inequality, the inequality actually constitutes a lack of liberty for the people who are disempowered, right? And so it's more like a question, like the people with power, one way to think about them is like there's some extent to which liberty is sort of zero sum, and they have like taken the liberties of others and like collected them unto themselves, right? And so that these people don't have liberty, the people who have been disempowered. And so it's a different conception of like the distribution of liberty rather than a disagreement over whether equality is more important than liberty.
And this is something that my husband and I talk about a lot. And I think that you're right in that, especially if you're looking at the sort of, democratic socialism that I think is, mainly successful globally right now, as opposed to, Soviet era communism or something like that. which you just don't see too much of anymore. Thanks to the CIA in part. That form of socialism that is successful now does seem to be about maximizing choices, maximizing personal liberty. Maybe not civil liberties writ large as we think of them in the United States, but if you think about Finnish women, right? If you have a baby, you can go back to work next week if you want. You can go back to work in a year, right? And so they're always trying to bump out those ranges of options, and so on and so forth. What's interesting about the Nordics that Matt always points out is they typically don't have minimum wage laws. And the unions don't want them because they would set a low floor. And without them, the unions can push up way high. But those laws would take away that liberty that they have, to get together, organize, and decide what they're going to do about capital. So I do think those forms of socialism are quite a bit about maximizing liberty. And then there's a sort of knock-on about equality. And I think you mostly see that culturally expressed. There's a real suspicion, I think, in those countries that could be a chicken or egg about people who want to, show themselves as, special or excellent or better. I think there's a real distaste for that.
Do you share that?
No. So I hit it on both sides. I have intense Catholic dislike of myself and hold myself in very low regard. But I find excellent people extremely interesting, and sort of the more peacockish they are about whatever it is they've got, the better I like them. And I mean, it's why Achilles is like so immediately irresistible, right? He's like, I'm Achilles, I'm the best of the Achaeans. He's not wrong, right? I mean, like, you got to hand it to him.
Though he mostly sulks in the arena.
Well, that's his prerogative. He's the best. Right? So, there is something very compelling to me about those types of people, and I find them very interesting. And I think about what it would be like to be excellent, right? I mean, I like superheroes and so forth in general. I read the Batman comics, but you're like, yeah, I mean, if I were that excellent, it would be hard not to become the sole arbiter of good and evil in Gotham. It would be my prerogative at that point. At some level, everyone's bitching about Batman. You're like, all right, do something about it. And if you can't, then maybe that tells you something about the nature of Batman. But I think those sort of fascinations are limited and circumscribed by, normal ethics and so forth. But yeah, those are my two sides of that.
Let me ask you about forgiveness. So, you had this tweet a little while ago in which you pointed out that people are inclined to talk about forgiveness sort of precisely in cases where the sin is not great, or to talk about it in terms of by excusing, in effect, and that maybe it was you, maybe it was someone who was responding to you, whatever. Maybe the idea is that Catholicism gives you this kind of resource, which is the thought of sort of forgiving the unforgivable, or recognizing that there really is a sin, and in some sense the sin really is something grievous and terrible, and then forgiving that rather than deflating the thing that you have to forgive. And what I wanted to ask, I want to hear more about that, but I wanted to say that I think you're right. I mean, or I don't know, I'm not a Catholic, but I sort of I get the same vibe from other Catholics about the possibilities of forgiveness. But I also wonder whether the idea of the sin as being profoundly unforgivable is also the Catholic idea. Mm-hmm. That is, that maybe sort of like Catholicism creates the problem and then also solves it.
Yeah.
And like that maybe the rest of us just don't have as robust an idea of unforgivable sins and are inclined to respond to evil by saying there are mitigating circumstances and blah blah. Anyway, so I just want to hear your thoughts, more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things. I think there's a tendency to think about forgiveness in terms of mitigation, like you said, and what is being mitigated. Well, the harm, right? So if someone knowingly, and willingly and with full clarity of mind plots for several months to a year to break into your house and kill your children, strictly to torture you, because it would be devastating. And they plan this out, they think about it, they're very logical, and they proceed with their plans and succeed. That's just, psychologically, that's going to be an effective plan, right? It's going to be completely devastating. Your life is permanently fucked up, right? And you will suffer an incredible amount. Okay, same situation where someone kills your kids, but it's a car accident. Now you're screwed. I mean, that's an extremely difficult thing to go through, but the psychological devastation is going to be significantly different if it was an accident, or even if it was someone who was maybe severely mentally ill, or even a case of mistaken identity where there was an intention to kill, but not these people. Those are going to have different effects. And so oftentimes it seems to me mitigation is about trying to reduce that harm such that the person can say, okay, forget it. You don't have to make it up to me, right? Because it's a much lesser thing to have to dismiss. What you have rightly pointed out is that actually when someone harms you, that never goes away and you never get back what you lost. Right? So we have this strange convention, which I've thought about writing about many times, where people try to make it up to you with money. You're like, what? If I'm walking down the street and you punch me in the face and I take you to court or whatever, you can be criminally punished, and then civilly you can have to pay me money. I don't want fucking money. I want my face unpunched. Like, I want that Tuesday back where I was walking down the street and I had a plan for the rest of my nice day in mind, and it happened. That's what I want back. You cannot have it. Right? And what the fuck is money supposed to do? Here's a little liberty for you, right? I mean, that's the idea. You can do whatever you want with this. You have, infinite possibilities now. You can buy yourself therapy, you can buy a car, put kids through college, do whatever you want. You can set it on fire if you feel like it. Right? But that's not what I want. And I think that is actually extremely key to reasoning in Christian ethics, which is once you harm, it's forever. It echoes in eternity, right? That moment you had where you could make the right decision and not, offend God's honor, or how, that's how Anselm would put it. That moment in time is forever lost, and you can never recover it. The most you can hope for is that you acknowledge it and you ask God to forgive you, and you do offer some mitigation, which is, I am severely fucked up. It's not that I cannot do right, it's that I habitually choose not to, because I am a broken, screwed up creature. I am so far from what you made me to be. I exist less than I should. Right? And this is the case that you make to God. There's a really interesting tradition in medieval Catholicism, the processa Satanae, where Satan takes humankind to trial. They set a court date and everything. Satan appears as a lawyer, arguing that he has property rights to all human souls because they are so fucked up. And the way that this trial proceeds is usually that the Virgin Mary offers to act as a representative, the defense. And it's either God or Jesus judging. And she is, I'll represent humanity. And, Satan usually objects. He's like, sir, that is the judge's mother. How is this fair? That's the first tip, because he's right about that. And this is where Christianity kind of shockingly comes out. Someone says process of what? Processus is just what they call legal cases, lawsuits. But this is where the trial shakes out. It's not fair. The devil gets completely fucked. It's not that he's wrong. He's right about the rules. He's right about the facts. He has all the evidence. Cry about it, right? The Virgin Mary says, yeah, I suppose that's all true, but you know what? Jesus, if you're going to damn all of humanity, then you'll just have to damn me too. And did I not nurse you at my breast? And can't do it. Won't. Right? That is forgiveness. It's not fair. And you can do all the mitigation you want, but when Jesus says, if someone slaps you, turn the other cheek, what he means is when someone hurts you, I'm going to ask you to incur some more pain. That's forgiveness. It's just abject. Someone hurts you and you hurt yourself a little more. You relinquish that claim you have on them. You say, I'm not going to pursue it. This hurts in the sense that now I don't even get this sort of pleasure of vengeance. I don't get the pleasure of recompense in some kind of way. In Rome, right, you could potentially have this person as a slave if you want to suit against them. Nope, no more of that. And I find that to be really interesting, and it's also an extremely hard pill to swallow. And the only justification for it is that that's what God's already doing for us. So it is a divine thing to do.
Right, but it's amazing if you think about how hard that is for God, and that Mary has to intervene on our behalf, right? But when it's me forgiving someone, there's like no Mary there, right? What I have to do in a way is even harder than what God has to do.
Right, and God doesn't need things. We do. So
right.
It's very tough.
So let me tell you, in terms of my own experience, there's a particular... I have more trouble forgiving words than actions. So, like, when someone says something to me and they might later be like, I wish I hadn't said it, or, I didn't mean it. Or they might not even say that. But it's like the words somehow stay with me.
Yeah.
And I really struggle with those cases of forgiveness. So you say that makes sense. Why does it make sense?
Well, because that's with someone just fucking up or doing something annoying, you can tell yourself all kinds of stories about what's going on inside them. But when they tell you what's going on inside them, that is what it is. And they can do all kinds of stuff later to say, I don't think that anymore. And you're like, that's great. I'm not pissed at you for this moment. I am pissed at you for that moment. Right? I am upset by the state you were in at that time. And you can never undo that because you, for some reason, decided to expose me to your stupid mind in that moment where you had a bad state of mind. I didn't want that. Now it's part of my reality. I think that makes a lot more sense than like, I don't know, my husband left the milk out and now it's nasty or something like that, or even, someone stands you up on a date or something. You can tell yourself a lot of different stories about what was going on with them. But if someone calls you and is like, yeah, I've considered coming on this date, but I'm not going to because I think I can actually secure a partner who's more attractive than you. That's going to be a lot more difficult to put up with, I think.
Do you, you were saying like, when you think about yourself, like you have a Catholic dislike of yourself.
Yeah.
Do you find that do you find that you have to forgive yourself? Is that a thing you do? It's not a thing I do. So no
mercy for oneself. Yeah, I have no mercy on myself.
Why? Why isn't that a thing you're supposed to do?
I think it is possibly a thing that you're supposed to do. I cannot think of any immediate scriptural warrant for it. I've talked to a lot of priests about it over time, and they say, well, it's a sin of like refusing to believe that God actually compassionately loves you. And I'm like, well, I think he wills my good. And they're like, no, but it's different than that. It's not just like an abstract and clinical willing of one's good. You know, I have difficulty with that. But also, like, who am I to forgive myself? I can't do that because I'm not the recipient of the harm. Or even if I am, I'm also the perpetrator. So it's difficult to rule in anyone's favor. And yeah, I mean, a shrink of mine recently said, you know, you can't live your entire life as penance. And I'm like, oh, but I can, and I will, and I am. This is perhaps too much id.
But the penance seems to be at least have as its goal some kind of forgiveness. Like if I'm doing penance, if I thought forgiveness were off the table, maybe I
yeah.
do it. Or
it's why they put people on death row in isolation, because now they have no incentive not to just terrorize everyone in their path, right? Because they know how it's going to end. Yeah, I mean, I still think it's worth being sorry, and that has like a natural expression in penance, I think. But yeah, I mean, you know, you come to terms with the fact that you're not, you know, half what you wish you were, and you can make peace with it. You can accept it, fully accept it. But trying to behave as though that's not a tragedy is a whole other thing that I just don't bother with. Yeah.
Totally switching topic. What's the main value you get out of being on Twitter?
Well, I find it very funny. I've found lots of humorous things on there. I was actually thinking about putting together a meme to help people understand my perspective on forgiveness, but also to just kind of revel in how weird and countercultural the Christian notion of forgiveness really is. And that, like, have you ever seen the meme format where it's like from a WikiHow and it's someone holding a cat's mouth open and putting a pill in it? So this is the meme hard to swallow pills, and then the pill bottle has a blank label for the meme maker. So that's where you would have like a little brick of text about, you know, forgiveness is actually blah 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 blah, and that's the hard to swallow pill. I actually think memes oftentimes are nice little packages for ideas like that. The other thing, I mean, Twitter, yeah, I don't know. I mean, part of it's obviously like self-harm.
People are really mean to you. Like it's shocking because people are not mean to me. And I just look at your account and I'm just like, whoa.
People hate me. Which is like funny on some level also, but also like probably confirms things that I need confirmed for me on some psychological level. It's not great. You know, you can blast your shit out and get people to click on it, which from a professional standpoint is useful. It's also great for meeting people. If you're, you know, even this exchange, right? I mean, just interesting people live in the world, and I'm very interested in people, and I like to meet them. I think fortunately my response to people being really mean to me is not to get angry in response, which makes it possible for me to kind of exist on Twitter. When people are really mean to me, I tend to either find it funny or get sad. And oftentimes both. But I think that makes it possible. And then, yeah, all kinds of curiosity, love of novelty. You know, Twitter's always changing. You can get that infinite scroll going. And you can also do, and I do, the dollhouse thing, right? Where I have like 1,000 tabs with searches open where I just monitor subcultures for no reason. I just like it, find it interesting. Watch a lot of U.S. Marines talk about being in the Marines and what they're annoyed by, and follow their little in jokes. And from their jokes, you can deduce a lot about their culture. And I find all that really interesting. I do that with Mormon women as well. It's just groups of people I find fascinating and wish to observe without bothering.
I want to ask you one more question about what Tyler, can you kind of get someone ready for the Q&A, because we're going to start with the Q&A in a minute. So I think it's super interesting, like there's a kind of voyeuristic element to, like, you're extremely curious and you're interested in people, and something that's nice about Twitter is that it allows for that without too much connection, actually.
Yeah, you can completely remain totally invisible. You can just lurk.
Or even when people are mean to you in a way, like, it sort of doesn't go that deep. I mean, it hurts my feelings when they do it too. Like, I don't get angry, but I do get sad. But it's still somehow a kind of sadness you can dissociate from.
Yeah.
I wonder whether you think do you think that fueling this aspect of ourselves is gonna like change people? Because I feel like it feeds exactly in you what it feeds in me too, and I'm like, that part of myself has grown, the part that thrives on curiosity and superficial connections to other people. And like, is that going to change people, and is it good to feed that part of oneself?
I do think it certainly it gears you towards it, and it strengthens that tendency, knowing how to meet that need and satiate it, of course, just it triggers the appetite for it. I was probably already somewhat wired in that way, but it certainly, has done nothing but turn that sort of, weird aspect of my personality into my career. Twitter's responsible for that. And I was thinking when I was witnessing the execution of Alfred Bourgeois, I was like, this is, basically where I've been headed my entire life, which is sitting silently in mute horror, looking through a window at something happening that I have no control over, just trying to understand it on a human level. That's all I've ever really wanted to do, and it's all I've spent most of my professional life doing, and I do it to my kids. I watch them all the time without them knowing, especially when they're interacting with each other. I find that really fascinating. And it's morally ambiguous, and I emphasize that all the time. I think that's a huge aspect of journalism that, I think it's currently being treated as a heroic profession for resistance people, and my view is it's very ambiguous what we do. They're in the play Doubt, right? The nun, head nun says, in the pursuit of wrongdoing, you step away from God. That's true. And insofar as you're ever going to do journalism that deals with injustice, you're not, you can't divorce yourself from it. What you're doing is going to have casualties, all kinds, unpredictable ones. And you know that going in. And you're not a detective, right? You have not been charged by society with this role. You're being paid by a company to produce a product. And it is ambiguous in that respect.
Okay, we're going to move to the Q&A now.
Yeah.
And so if you show up on the screen and we're not responding to you, like the way we were just not responding to Catherine for a minute, she did exactly what you're supposed to do, namely just sit there and we will get to you. Generally, the subsequent question is sort of waiting on the screen as we're finishing answering the previous question, because otherwise there's too much of a lag between questions. So thank you for your patience, Catherine. Go ahead.
Sure. So I kind of had two questions. One I think is easier than the other. You talked early on about showing people your id. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, what it means to show your id to someone. And then a more broad question that I had going into this is, and you talked a little bit about opinion writing and having a drum to beat. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how or if we should try to separate news that is journalist opinion based and news that is like reporting facts about certain cases, if those things can be separated and clarified for readers.
Yeah, so to break it up in half, like how do you expose someone to your id? Your id just being like your unmediated base desires and interests, the things that compel you. Part of it is making explicit things that are probably typically subterranean, right? Because you're dealing with people who have been through really difficult things, or in my case, that's what I'm always dealing with. People who've been through really, really difficult things, oftentimes a source of their suffering is that they don't like the way that they feel about it, right? So you have people who are frustrated at themselves, angry at themselves that they are hurt instead of angry, or that someone did something bad to them and they missed them, or that someone totally destroyed their life and they're still not sure that they didn't deserve it, but they know they should be sure, and they don't feel good because they have that doubt. And all I do is say like, oh, I completely have all of those feelings, right? You think about, I was asking someone on Twitter the other day, have you ever been hit in the face with full force by a grown man? Because I have, many times, right? And I miss that person all the time and still interact with them frequently. Typically with me kind of like trying to coax them into interacting with me and having a relationship, and them being more or less disinterested. And I'm able to acknowledge like, yeah, I mean, that's, there's no compelling desire. You can educate it, right? But it ultimately is what it is. And a lot of people feel like you're going to, or they have this expectation that you're going to make some kind of critical judgment on those sort of deepest emotions and desires. And I think by exposing one's own without judgment, you're indicating that you're not really interested in or going to pass sort of critical judgment on those sort of elemental things. As for facts, sort of newsroom, news side journalism versus opinion side. Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously there are opinions built into what is acceptable on the news side, right? I mean, you're allowed to say 9/11 was on balance not good in news reporting, right? You're not like a complete blank slate where you're like, could be good, it could be bad. Some people would consider Osama bin Laden a liberator. That's not really permissible. So it's obvious that we already price in a certain amount of sort of commonly accepted opinion. But I think it's just about proportions or ranges. Trying to hit that 90% of people would agree with this ethical premise, and making it a fairly subtle part of the report. It seems fine and typical. And then I think there is a different place in the paper for people to see more explicit treatments of that stuff, if that makes sense. I think it's useful. I think we should have different editors, and that's what we do have.
Okay. Hi, Mary. Hi, Nick. We're going to go to Nick's question first, so Mary, just hold on. Nick, go ahead.
Okay. My question is just noting that there's a decrease in public trust in journalism over the last, say, decade compared to times before that. And I'm wondering if there's any discussion of changes, institutional changes or personal changes that journalists could make. Maybe things to do with accessibility of information about them, that might increase public trust, because it seems like journalism needs public trust in order to perform its function well.
Yeah, different people have made different proposals regarding regaining public trust. I think it matters. I also think there's a large element of it that's foregone conclusion. Because I don't think the drop in public trust in journalism is limited to journalism. I think there's just like a wider legitimation crisis going on. And once those get rolling, I mean, you're just a character in history. And I hope that there is some kind of reversal or change, but I don't know if there can be. When I contact people to interview them, very often they don't like the Times or they don't like the media, and I'm always like, yeah, you don't have to. I'm not asking you to trust the Times or the media. I'm asking you to trust me, and I can tell you about me and what I'm interested in and why I do what I do. And I think my record is fairly decent evidence of what I say about myself being as true as I can know it to be. But yeah, it's a problem. And I don't think it's immediately solvable.
Can I just ask a follow-up on that? Do you think that journalists trust journalism less than they used to? Like have maybe a less idealized, like your conception of it that you were describing, like right before we went to questions, when you were like, it's not clear that what we're doing is so noble, and like it's not a very elevated or idealized conception. And so I wonder whether it extends, the lack of faith in some sense extends to journalists themselves.
No, the opposite. You look at pre-professional journalism, that noir period that we're talking about. These are journalists who recognized that what they were doing was morally ambiguous, questionable. Right? There wasn't the actually, if you've ever seen the movie LA Confidential, which is a very fun sort of neo-noir, there's an amazing tabloid reporter who's Danny DeVito. But at the time, not a huge difference between a tabloid and a weekly. And oftentimes those guys were getting scoops like crazy, like gangbusters. And there's something kind of fabulous about that. But they knew what they were, and they were not trying to behave as though they were, the late saviors of democracy. And since journalism has become professionalized, it's an extension of, the prestige professions that you can go into coming out of university, especially a good university. There have always been doctors, lawyers, professors, job titles that carry dignity in society, and you're understood to be contributing in some way, business leaders and so forth. Journalism is now one of those things instead of a less clear, more working class thing, right? And that comes with all the usual, you ask doctors if what they think they're doing is ambiguous. No. We save people. Well, you do a lot of things. Right? You make all kinds of choices. I understand you're trying to do good. No one, as far as I know, is like, I am in journalism to do evil. Right? But there's ambiguity there. Lawyers are maybe more cognizant of the fact that there's an enormous amount of ambiguity around what they do, but even they will try to tell you, no, there's not, But journalists, I think, have now joined the ranks of those, sort of prestige professions where you're not required to think that what you're doing is sus, even though it is. And it's reinforcing, mutually reinforcing, as we talked about with faith. That's one of the things that Twitter does. Everybody starts talking to each other and confirming their sense that they're doing nothing wrong.
Hey, Jade. Nice to see you.
Hi, it's nice to see you too. Thank you so much. This has been really interesting so far. My question was about earlier in the talk when you were kind of discussing your instinct for joining journalism, and I had interpreted it kind of as a voyeuristic instinct. Maybe that's being a little not generous. But I was then really curious about what do you see as the difference between voyeurism and empathy, and especially what the difference between those two are in journalism.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's an extremely voyeuristic instinct. On the id level, the odd thing is I'm not really a voyeur, right? Like well, yeah, I am psychologically. I'm just not very visual. I can't see very well, and I don't really fucking care to. I'm fine, and I have glasses, and I sometimes have them on, rarely, because like having a kind of light blur effect applied to everything is forgiving and quite nice. I also have a condition where I see halos around lights, and they tell me they can fix that, like shaving off part of your cornea or something, and I'm like, why would I ever change that? At any rate, yeah, I do think it's a kind of voyeurism. And I say that without judgment. I mean, certainly everyone's going to have some kind of frame like that they engage with the world through. Empathy, I mean, being able to or willing to experience vicariously in some way, emotionally or intellectually, the experiences of others, I think is just built into any voyeur who, any self-respecting voyeur is not watching with total detachment, right? They're trying to get a hold of those feelings. And whether you want to or not, you're gonna. People email me a lot. You work on such dark material. How do you preserve your soul? I'm like, I don't. It's you feel very strange all the time. It's like, but at the same time, it's what I want to be doing. Yeah, I think, you can divorce the idea of empathy in that I do think it's totally possible to be, say, like an amazing social worker or therapist who's not trying to see every part. That's not, they're not trying to, like, if you've ever seen the movie The Cell, there's a scene in there where, like, so sorry for what I'm about to say, but a guy drops like a bunch of pieces of glass onto a horse that immediately dissect it into like sheets of horse, which is based on an art exhibit called "Some Comfort Gained from the Acceptance of the Inherent Lies in Everything." Which nothing has ever summed up the tonal nature of my thoughts every day, like the comfort gained from the acceptance of the inherent lies and everything. But that's what a voyeur is interested in. And I think that is distinct from someone who's just empathetic, like a therapist or a priest or someone, a social worker, who's just trying to understand how you feel, and they don't have to see it all, and they're really not asking for a level of disclosure that's kind of like, self-dissecting. Because that's not what they're interested in, or the kind of, contradictory elements of human nature. They're just trying to help you feel better, or to understand what you're feeling so they can help you in some way. And, journalists are not therapists, right? Journalists need them. And even though you're having conversations with people that are often very similar to the ones that a therapist would have, I remind people, like, definitely you should be talking to someone during this process, because just telling the story is gonna resurface a lot of stuff, and I'm gonna ask you questions that cause you to remember things, and it's gonna be on your mind, and you're like, this isn't gonna affect me. How could it? It's already happened. It will, and you need to have someone on hand to help you with that, because I cannot do it. I don't know how. I'm not trained. Right. So, like, beware that this has the potential to cause you a lot of suffering. And I don't want to. That's certainly not what I'm in it for. It's just part of this process. And when I say that it's a very morally ambiguous profession, that's what I mean.
Are people inclined to, in effect, think that you are going to be the one to help them with it?
Yeah. They bond, because when you're doing all this self-disclosure, the bond is real. I mean, it has a purpose, right? And oftentimes you are in a position to help them in some kind of way, in the sense that public attention to their struggle could help. But those emotional bonds form and they're real. Of people I've worked with on stories I still talk to every day. Stories from years ago, right? Because those bonds, they happen, they're real, they endure. And when you're bonded with someone in that way, you have some expectation that they might be able to help you with how you feel, and to the degree that knowing someone knows and doesn't judge you helps, then that's a way that we can be helpful. But oftentimes people who have gone through sort of traumatic experiences I'm writing about certainly need a lot more help than I can provide. And I try to be very, very explicit about that, because I don't want them to go into it blind, not knowing what the effect could be.
Kevin, thanks for waiting.
Sure. Thanks for taking my question. You were talking earlier about some of your peak religious experiences, and I think on Twitter you also referred to some of them, like one that led to your conversion to Catholicism, and I was wondering whether that would ever be something that you wrote about or shared with people publicly.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hokey, right? I mean, people, like everybody is the host of Penn and Teller's bullshit now. They're all interested in like, actually, that's a phenomenon known as, I'm like, whatever, dude. Which one of us seems happier with the experience, you or me? All right, leave me be. And so there's always the, you don't want to deal with someone else trying to mediate your own experience for you, because it's frustrating. So I've kept the, I will say that one time I was in Mass, and it was a normal Sunday Mass. My husband was watching my kids. It was a lot. Like I had like a 3-year-old and a newborn. If you've never had a baby, after you have a baby, if you deliver them the old-fashioned way, you bleed for about 6 weeks. It's very unpleasant. This was after that period where, I was hale and hearty and like back in fighting shape, but just not getting any sleep and still nursing and so forth. So I'm in Mass, and the priest is consecrating the host, right? Hold all this stuff. And I immediately smelled blood and was like, oh God, great. Bleeding in a pew, fabulous. I'm probably going to stand up and there's just going to be a puddle of it, which could happen in the few months postpartum. Wouldn't be the first time. And the smell was so overwhelmingly strong of blood that I was like, I've got to do something, because people are going to start being like, someone exsanguinating. And I was, sort of beginning to find my own situation humorous, bleeding all over the place in church. And then I could taste it very strongly. And I've tasted a lot of blood in my life. I have epilepsy. I've had a lot of seizures. You tend to hurt the inside of your mouth. I tasted a lot of blood for a lot of different reasons. And I was like, maybe I'm having a nosebleed. It goes down the back of your throat. You get that nice post-nasal drip of blood. And I actually can check for that, because that also happens. So I, discreetly, no blood, right? I stood up to get in line for the Eucharist. I was not bleeding. There, wasn't my blood, right? So, but the very experience of blood was as coppery and thick and syrupy and meaty and animal as any experience of any blood I've ever had in my life. right? And it endured until I received the Eucharist, and then it was gone. So there you go. That's one of them.
Mary. Hi.
Hi. My question was kind of based on, I'm a writing student considering a career in journalism, and I am from the Deep South and don't exactly align with my family, politically. And I was wondering how you prepare yourself mentally to publish a piece, knowing that there's going to be pushback from people that you respect and love.
Oh yeah. The only thing that you can do is say to yourself, was I ethical in putting this together? Did I do everything I could to minimize harm to my sources and subjects? Is there a snowball's chance in hell that this will help someone in some way, even just by being beautiful? Beauty is such a powerful thing, and it's extremely important. And if you can answer yes to all of those questions, that you did your best to be ethical, that you did your best to mitigate harm, that you did your best to maximize the amount of help that you might be able to offer, and you are true to your ethics, you put all your cards on the table, you're not hiding anything from the reader, you're being completely honest with them and totally respectful of them, in that you know why they might disagree, you accept it, then that's all you can do. You've done your part, and the way that people respond is ultimately going to be outside of your control, and painful when people are mean, but you've done all you can do, I think, morally, and that's what I do. My parents, I wrote a Pulitzer nominated article on the unprosecuted gang rape of a high school classmate of mine. Well, it was unprosecuted because people didn't believe her. My parents didn't either. And when I was reporting that story, I was in my hometown, living in my childhood bedroom. And my parents were pissed that I was working on this, because they were like, this was Matt, what are you doing? Get up. Because this was something they didn't want to hear about. They weren't interested in this girl who they assumed, like everyone had at the time, to be bad, liar and worse. And that was hard. They were pissed at me all the time. They were pissed after it came out. They've never read it. Right? And you're like, all right, suit yourself. You want to be wrong about shit. That's all you can do at the end of the day. But but it wasn't easy, and so I was asking myself those questions the whole time, and I was always answering, yeah, I've done my best here.
Mary, I'm going to answer your question too, and then we'll get to you, Ajay. Hi, Ajay. It's nice to see you, by the way. Which is that I have a kind of tendency in me to argue against positions that I see out there, people I see out there, like supporting something, and I'm like, no, here's why that's wrong. And my husband is always the one who pushes me to say, what is the positive thing here, right? So it's like, okay, they're wrong, right? But what is the positive thing about getting right about this? Like, what is the good thing that we get into view? And I'm always annoyed by this. Like, everything I write, pretty much, he's like that voice of like, don't just argue against these people. Like, don't just show what they're wrong about. Don't just react to them. And so for me, like, a big part of how do I, and these are often people I like, and the people I'm pushing back against, a big part of it for me is finding a way to make sure that what I'm saying is not just a reaction. Even if I think my reaction is correct, it has to be more than a reaction. That's like I'm committed to that. And whenever I can take what I'm writing and make it to the more than reaction part, that's always when it really improves. Ajay. Oh, Ajay, we can't hear you. No. Oh, now I think we can. Try. Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. So my question is, so I'm also a Catholic, but I haven't really followed the more recent rounds of the abuse crisis, like in the past couple of years, very closely. Mostly because, like, just from past experience reading about sexual abuse, I find it just like very painful to read about, and I like have felt uncomfortable reading about the sexual abuse in the church. And but like I feel sort of guilty about that. Like I'm neglecting some sort of important obligation by, or at least some obligation by not like confronting it squarely. And I'm not really sure what the obligation is when I like think about it. I haven't been able to formulate one. But so I'm curious, I guess, if either of you think there is an obligation, both maybe specifically in the case of like this situation, but also more broadly, like an obligation to confront the like raw details of serious wrongs or injustices perpetrated by like institutions that you're part of or identify closely with in some way.
What do you think, Agnes?
I struggle with the same thing. So I experienced sexual abuse a long time ago, but it's very hard for me to read about it, and I don't watch movies, and like if it's fiction, I just don't. I feel like I know I don't have a duty, and so I don't tend, if I know, or I just won't watch that part or whatever. But you know, I've had students who experience sexual abuse and who come to me to talk to me about it, and I have to be able to like participate in that conversation fully. That's where I've had to like really overcome a certain kind of block that I had of like, I'm just not going to think about this. So I'm not Catholic and I haven't followed the Catholic Church, but for me there, it's like, it was really mentoring students that kind of turned me around there in terms of saying, making myself able to tolerate the pain of other people. And I do feel like I have that duty. But that's a one-on-one conversation. It's not an inquiry. So that's where it has shown up for me in my life.
I would say just because the subject deserves, I'm not drinking the candle, it's a nosedill, I'm smelling it. There's an obligation that someone pays attention to it. It doesn't necessarily have to be you in particular, you know, especially if there are reasons that you can't, that it's difficult for you in a special way. And, you know, especially, you know, there was this question about raw details. Someone asked, you know, I think that was Ajay, how obligated are we to like dig into the very raw details? I'm, you know, I do that myself by choice in this line of work, almost because I feel like was pretty open earlier about having experienced, protracted physical violence throughout my life. Not sexual violence, but just, being battered. We always sort of end up somewhat hostile to the parts of yourself that are injured, at least in the moment, because you're like, hey, this is principally the thing causing me pain right now. Like, yes, someone else did it, but I can't do anything about them or control them. But I am super pissed that my ribs hurt and just wish that I existed in a non-corporeal form, like a sphere of energy or something. And, over time, one moves on, I think, from those feelings, ideally. But I remember feeling that way. And I think with sexual abuse, those sorts of, feelings of kind of disintegration, of being like a collection of disjointed parts, and also feelings of hostility towards your own self, your own desires, and your own body can be very, very intense. And so part of the reason that I do pay attention to and ask about in my work, these very elemental, raw, painful details, partially because it's important in the reporting process, partially because, well, like you think about Jesus, he always touches people to heal them, though he doesn't have to, right? The centurion shows up, right, and is like, I have a servant. I didn't bring him, because I know if you say it, it'll be done. And Jesus is like, bingo. And wherever this person is, they are healed, Jesus says. They're not present. Right, but he still chooses to touch it. Lepers, a woman with a bleed, people who are considered unclean, right? And because when another person, be they God or not, acknowledges and interacts with and recognizes the dignity and importance of those parts of a person that were damaged or exploited or harmed, there's an amazing redemptive power there. I always think about Jesus asking Thomas then, if he doubts him, to put his fingers in his wounds. And there's a huge part of Catholicism that's very interested in this kind of viscera. And I think that's why, is because it's hugely redemptive, right? You're going to someone and saying, show me the part of yourself that you hate the most. I don't hate it. I think there's dignity there. I think there's meaning, and I think there's value. And what happened to you wasn't fair. That's why I'm interested in as a news reporter, right? But on a more human level, you're just saying there's no shame here. Not for me. And that seems like important.
Caleb, hi.
Hi. I was just curious, in your experience as a writer, how you've gone about pitching and writing about things that are very nuanced, very complicated. Oftentimes, say your death penalty article, very controversial in a world that seems more and more obsessed with very emotional, very short slogan answers to questions, and things that can fit into a tweet as opposed to long, complicated responses to these questions. The sorts that you tend to write about in your articles.
Yeah, well, I like ambiguity quite a bit. It's probably clear, and that sort of runs afoul of many sensibilities, not just the sort of dominant cultural sensibilities among liberals and leftists, but also just sort of the news industry. So many times I've had this argument with my editor. He's like, why do you intentionally want to leave shit unclear? I'm like, well, because it's not clear. I'm being as clear as it's possible to be, and the truth is that it is not clear. The only clarity I can bring to this is that if you think there's a clarity, there isn't, and you're wrong. And the actual truth is that there's a huge amount of unclarity. And the news industry resists this, right? Because their job is, to tell you the news, inform you. And so my habit of kind of trying to take away certainty is maybe, runs a little bit contrary to that. And so the way I always try to pitch it is, Well, I'm not saying that it's unknown and unknowable or like ineffable, just that it's more complicated than it may initially seem. So I'm actually adding information, even just by juxtaposing two things that are often not juxtaposed. And I, try to be very frank, where I'm like, most people would think X, Y, Z, but I actually think many things also, and X, and in some degree Z with a component of Y. And try to, be very explicit about the ways in which I think things are more complicated than they seem, or that they're ill apprehended, or something.
Yeah, I guess it's, Catherine, we'll get to your question in 1 minute. I just wanted to follow up on this because it seems to me like there's a difference between something like complexity and something like ambiguity. I
Yes.
think, right?
Yes.
Where ambiguity, and I think both have a role to play in writing, but ambiguity is where you just leave something indeterminate.
Yes.
And complexity is where you take something that someone might have one response or the other and say, like, well, this is how it is in this way, and this is how it is this way. And, it's the thing Aristotle was famous for. He's like, in one respect, like drawing distinctions.
Oh, very acquainted.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, do you see a role for, like, in over and above complexity, a role for ambiguity specifically?
Yeah, I always, so my husband, Matt, who you just saw lurking in the background here, Matt is the polar opposite, right? He frequently says he hates language. He doesn't think in words. He only really is interested in philosophy because it's an extension of math. In his view, and so on. He said he had to start doing philosophy because he had finished with all the math, which is totally
it's not why I started philosophy.
where I come to it from. But Matt is very interested in clarity to the degree that he doesn't like fiction, but occasionally I can get him to watch just a film, not a documentary, which is what he prefers to watch. And I'm always like, God, I hate the last bit. Just cut it off, right? So like in the tank movie, Fury, World War II tank crew, recently watched it. I hate to spoil it for you, but it's illustrative. There's like one guy left standing at the end of a battle, and this other guy who's about to die tells him how he can like escape the tank and avoid detection and survive. And he indeed gets rescued the next day and called a hero and put in a little car and taken away. I'm like, no, fuck that. Cut it, right? Just get rid of that beat. I don't want to know if he made it or not. I want to have to make my conclusions without that certainty. I want to have to decide if this whole enterprise was worth it, whether or not my dog in the fight made it out, right? Make it hard. Make me decide a tough case, not an easy case. And I'm always looking for really hard cases when I write, which is, the death penalty piece is a good example of that, right? That guy, the crime was fairly severe. And I do think there's a place for that. I have made peace with the fact that it's primarily in art, not newspapers. So I end up injecting a lot less ambiguity than I would like to, but it's because of the form and the function that it serves. If I were writing art, if I were doing more essayistic stuff, I think I would be, going even more nuts with the, because I'm not an Aristotelian, I'm a Platonist. I'm a big old Christian Neoplatonist. And much unlike Aristotle and Aquinas, Augustine and Plato were like, well, maybe it's many things.
But also, I feel like maybe the appeal of that ambiguity for you, it connects up with the thing that is kind of driving you into journalism, which is a certain kind of like problem that you can also see reflected in yourself, right? Mm-hmm. A kind of problem of judgment that is also a problem of self-judgment. Mm-hmm. And maybe it resonates as a problem of self-judgment much more if there isn't some kind of clean answer given.
I think that's right. I think it's much more reflective of a kind of internal state. And it's also tragic, right? And I find the key that I like to write in is tragedy. And I think that's the most reflective of the human experience, especially from a Catholic point of view. This is not going to end well. Like in many ways, it's already ended, and it's already ended badly, right? There have been several apocalypses, right? And they've all reflected quite poorly on humanity. There was an end of the world at the destruction of Eden, and there was an end of the world when God in human form was cast out of it, right? There have been many ends of the world. They've all been pretty sad for humanity. Yet I root for us. And apparently God does as well, which is interesting to me. And I am endlessly interested in the tensions and the problems there. And I think that a lot of them are just ambiguous. There's just a lot of, it's the news. I don't know. And it might just be that I'm not a very analytical thinker. Like you and my husband are. It's possible that I just don't have the horsepower, and I've come to frame it as an aesthetic. But again, even that is ambiguous to me.
I once asked an economist who was like, there's an economic analysis of everything. And I'm like, what about tragedy? And he's like, no, I don't know what tragedy. And then I asked like another economist that same question. Every economist I meet, I actually ask them this question. I'm like, do you have an analysis of tragedy? So I think there is something there. There's something like, a kind of economic utilitarian calculus, like doesn't have a way to articulate tragedy other than like very bad stuff, like, lots of displeasure or something. That's not tragedy.
You're
right?
always trying to mitigate it. Always trying to mitigate it, just like in the case of forgiveness. That exact same worldview tries to mitigate everything. You're like, well, this is a tragedy. And they're like, no, actually, I can find total culpability on one side. So it's actually just an infraction. It's a violation. That way I can do my normal mitigation procedure and it's actually okay. It doesn't exist. No, not true. And even if it were true, it would be ugly. Tragedy is much more beautiful. I think.
Catherine, I'm sorry, we've kept you waiting. Please.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. I feel bad because my question sort of is backtracking to a topic we talked about quite a while ago, so it's kind of a drastic turnaround here. But I was thinking about Nick's question about lack of trust, and we had a conversation in the chat there about, if things are more transparent, and people can feel more involved in institutions, there's some research that shows that people trust those institutions more. And I'm thinking a lot about anonymous sources, and so much of the reporting that we saw coming out, especially with the Trump presidency, a lot of it was all based on anonymous sources. And I have a very conservative Catholic family, and their critique was always, well, this is all just made up. Like, how do we know anything that what they're saying is true? Like, they don't trust the media at all. And that this extensive use of anonymous sources, I think, really fosters that mistrust. And I'm just wondering, I understand the need for anonymous sources, like you wouldn't be able to get a lot of the information that we get otherwise, but how can we sort of mitigate that with the mistrust issue? And if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I have not used anonymous sources. Theoretically, there's an extraordinarily high bar. To render a piece anonymous, there are a couple of ways that happens, right? This is a whole piece, but it goes for sources as well. One, it's either so low stakes, it doesn't matter. So if you want to write on XO Jane about how you had a brief affair with, the redheaded guy from Happy Days, fine, go for it. You're anonymous. Or there's simply no other way to access the information, and the risk to the source would be unacceptable. At the Washington Post, I remember we ran a piece by a woman who had been in a relationship with a man who was a member of ISIS, and she was still overseas. So there actually was an element of risk that was extremely concerning. And on the other hand, her insight into a developing story of great interest and public service was vital. So in that case, they made the call to go ahead and grant her anonymity. But it's always a live question. There are like promulgated journalistic ethics. You can look at the Society of Professional Journalists handbook of ethics they put out. I think every couple of years I taught a whole Georgetown course on, the course was called Telling the Truth. And it was about why I think that's harder than it seems. But internal to journalism, there are, we're not like governed by laws. You can print whatever you want on a paper. We're governed by internal rules we impose upon ourselves. And therefore, a lot of these anonymity things are judgment calls. They're just coming down to individual editors and their teams and the pressures that they're feeling, and the decisions that they make in the circumstances aren't necessarily going to be replicable or universalizable. And I therefore can't speak to, whether we should ban them on the whole or so on. Just that. My experience has been that there's a very high bar, and even Francis M., for example, this is a man who is a victim of childhood sexual abuse. Even the state won't release records, otherwise public records related to those kinds of incidents. So that's a pretty good indicator that anonymity is thought publicly to be earned in those occasions. And we still used his actual middle name and actual initial, right? Because the Times is so reluctant to ever grant anonymity. But yeah, I mean, if I were news reporting and I could only get something from an anonymous source, I would try like hell to get it from somebody on the record. You can usually get the same information multiple ways. It's very rare that only one person knows something. So then it's just a matter of, can you find someone for whom the risk is acceptable to them or you? And I would encourage, all journalists to do that at every possible juncture.
Connor, I'm going to get to your question one second, but I want to ask as a follow-up question. Like, can you give me what are the top 3 reasons why it's hard to tell the truth?
Yeah, well, it's hard to know what it is. And that's not just because it's hard to identify the facts and evidence, but that it's hard for you to adopt enough varied mindsets and approaches to evidence that would allow you to see, in a kind of kaleidoscopic way, how certain sets of facts can actually have multiple truth values. So one thing a detective does, right, is they get a bunch of fragments of reality. A phone log that shows that a call was made at this time, and someone at a diner who saw a guy at a particular time, and a body with these wounds and these bank transactions. And no one's going to tell you what the truth is, right? It's probably likely that only one person even knows it, if that. They might not even know the whole truth. So you're having to introduce something sui generis into the world, which is a complete narrative of how all of these fragments of reality fit together. There are a lot of ways that can go wrong. Journalists have the exact same job to do if you're doing anything investigative. You have maybe police reports, interviews, stuff you find on the internet. People leave lots of fragments laying around on social media, Facebook pictures, photographs, text messages, and so forth. And you are then faced with the task of birthing into the world this narrative. And it's very hard. There are a lot of ways that can go awry. And then, there is the issue of moral truth being a huge component of what is true. So, you can make certain statements like, whatever, the Holocaust was an incident in which millions of people were killed, which is not false, right? But severely understates the evil there, that it was a targeted killing, that it was a genocide. that it was unilateral, right? It's not like the world voted on 6 million of the worst people, right? It was a right, heinous crime against humanity that was carried out unilaterally by a single fascist sovereign state. And therefore, journalists are always in the difficult position of deciding what moral information is so critical to understanding an issue that they need to include it. And so those, I think, are probably the top 3 reasons that telling the truth is harder than it seems. And a lot of that class was just talking about public reason and talking yourself out of it and learning to think in all kinds of different ways about the same things, including the classic Led Zeppelin lyric, because sometimes words have 2 meanings, but that's also true of realities and facts. Sometimes they bear multiple valences.
Connor, hi. Thanks for waiting.
Hi. Thanks so much. This conversation has been wonderful, and I've learned a lot, and you're making me think a lot. So thanks so much. My question is mostly, I'm interested in the relationship that you might see between journalism and humor, because I'm somebody who's very interested in thinking about humor philosophically. And Arthur Schopenhauer, he said that things are funny when you perceive an incongruity in the world. Mm-hmm. And that seems right to me. And also it seems as though journalism is an enterprise that's invested in trying to bring to light certain sorts of incongruities in the world and make them apparent to people. In preparation for this talk, I rewatched Spotlight, and the sort of investigative journalism that happens in that movie, certainly when the information that the journalists brought to light came to light, it was shocking for everybody. And it was the type of shocking that wasn't funny, but deeply distressing. And so it seems like journalism, on the one hand, is incongruous in the sense that it creates distress when you reveal the incongruity, and humor, when you reveal the incongruity, creates mirth. But it seems like you're really good at both humor and journalism. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about the connections between these 2 things.
I don't know that I'm any good at either, but thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Well, comedy is sort of the obverse of tragedy, right? So as much as I love the tragic form and find it, probably the most beautiful artistic form, comedy is just the obverse of that, where you're taking, pretty much the same elements. Have you, Agnes, you're familiar with the parable of the toad and the scorpion?
I don't think so. Maybe I will if you say it. Maybe I'll recall
it. It's a very, very simple parable about, inherence. So toad is crossing a river, scorpion crossing a river, I can't swim. And the toad says, no, you'll just sting me. And the scorpion's like, why would I sting you? Because then we would both drown and die. And the toad's like, yeah, that's a good point. So he takes the scorpion on his back, and midway through the river, the scorpion does in fact sting him. The toad, as he's dying, says, why would you do that? Now we're both going to die. And the scorpion says, well, it's in my nature. That is tragic and comic. 2 creatures that are dying. And this is often also told for funny effect. In fact, I saw a meme the other day just to emphasize how completely destroyed my brain is by posts. It was, obviously a picture taken from a children's retelling of this parable, a toad with a scorpion on his back in a river, and they're both drowning. And the toad was saying, why would you do that? Now we'll both drown. And the scorpion said, LMAO. This is every time you sin and you fuck up in the same ways over and over again, I mean, it gets progressively more despairing and also progressively funnier. When people say things like, it is just like me to XYZ, or it is just my luck, they are having a bit of a laugh in a tragic situation, which is that there's some horrible thing that is eternally recurring on them, right? And I don't find it hard at all to thread that needle. When bad things happen to me, I recognize them. I usually find them somewhat funny as well. Just because, it's funny when you get owned by, history, circumstance. I was buying a copy of the New York Times at the grocery store one time, and I was reading it, and a guy was like, you read the paper much? I was like, yeah, I write for the Times, actually. And it was just very clear he didn't believe me. And that it was just like, it seemed like a weird lie to tell socially, but then there was no way that I could disabuse him of that. So I was just like, no, I don't act. And I was just completely stuck conversationally. Likewise, one time I was walking down the street in DC, and I had my Washington Post t-shirt on. I was at the Post that time, and someone goes, "Do you work at the Post?" And I just said no, reflexively. Those kinds of failures, I think, are where you just kind of whiff on like being a human in society and are also really funny. It's hard to thread the needle, right? And you never want to take really intense, tragic experiences and reframe them in a way that they were not experienced by the subject, because that can be very disorienting and disrespectful. So I try to be careful about that. But on Twitter, and especially at my own expense, I think the tragedy of, being human is also very funny. And I do occasionally in lower stakes articles have some jokes in there a bit.
Eric, I'll get to your question in a second. I wanted to say something about humor. I don't remember why I did this. It was like at least 5 years ago. I went and did a search through the entire Platonic corpus for all words relating to laughter and humor. It's easy because it's one root, right? In Greek, like in English, we have humor, laughter, all these different, but in Greek, it's just one. It's like galoion, gelastai. Okay. And I discovered something interesting, which is that, first of all, words of this kind are extremely frequent. Like they show up in like almost all the dialogues. There'll be some word. I remember why I was doing this. I was looking at a bunch of different things, like what are some words that show up everywhere? And the two things, memory, words for remembering and memory show up in like most dialogues, and then humor. But the humor one, what was interesting was that it was almost always in a negative context. And what I mean is, Socrates is essentially saying something like, the fact that you want to laugh at something doesn't mean that it's false. Don't take laughter too seriously. Okay, this may sound ridiculous. Another, ridiculous is another word we use to translate the same root. It may sound ridiculous, but it might be true. And ever since I did that, it occurred to me that there's something like, there's a kind of almost like opposition between philosophy and humor, in that I think that even though humor is often quite philosophical, what it does is it like discharges a certain thought, so it ends it, right?
Yeah.
And you sort of laugh and it's over and you don't need to think about it anymore. And I think that what the philosopher wants to do is like not lose that energy and just keep going. And like, maybe it sounds ridiculous, maybe it sounds crazy, but what if this can get us somewhere, right? What if we don't want to be done with it? So anyway, and of course, one still has to laugh when doing philosophy. I found one fun thing that's different with online teaching. Like, I'm mostly teaching in person, but I've had a bunch of sessions online, way less laughter. Like somehow people just don't laugh together as much in an online content. I mean, it's worse in every other way as well, but that was one that jumps out at me. So like, there's definitely a human importance, but it's somehow weirdly, like if you take this weird fact that I discovered by doing this word search, it's somehow philosophers try to push in the opposite direction of humor, I think. And not for this, because it's tragedy, not to be sensitive, but to inquire.
my husband, so Matt, is very, very philosophically minded and much better than I am. And he, he has the unique talent due to his gift of autism, to like say something funny, accept that it's humorous, wait for someone to laugh, and then drill forward, which just kind of leads to like a mounting humor. In one instant, I remember we were talking about the point at which something becomes gross. So not to get into men biting their nails, but they do, and it's disgusting.
I bite my nails too.
If you think of like a whole human fingernail in your mouth, that is disgusting to me, right? And I was telling Matt, cut your fucking nails like a human. Sit there chewing them off like an animal. It's disgusting. I don't want to see it. And he was like in his Buddha-like way, he's like, if you spit into a cup for an hour, you wouldn't want to drink it. But it had just been in your mouth. I was like, yeah, I got it. Yes, granted. Where are we going with this? I'm just trying to understand. Right? I'm trying to figure out where the line is. And this is like one of his permanent personality characteristics that I find really endearing, but it is true that typically kind of statement like that would be the end of it. And maybe even a socially acceptable way to bow out would be to make a joke of it. And it in fact reads as very strange when someone makes a joke like that and you expect it to be their exit, their graceful exit from an embarrassing situation, but actually they keep going and like try to justify chewing their nails off. And that conversation went all over the place. He's like, yet you don't find Claire disgusting and she was once in your body. I'm like, yeah, I don't know that I would eat her. I'm not going to put her back. Right? I mean, like, I'm not asking you to be viscerally disgusted by your nail as separate from your body in the trash can. I'm asking you not to ingest it and not in front of me. And I'm sure we got to some kind of clarity on that eventually. But anyway, fully agree. Sorry.
Eric, I'm going to give you the last question because we're almost out of time. So go ahead. Thank you for waiting.
Sure. So my question, how responsible should we hold informational or social networks for the way information is presented? Or how much of the way we intake information is our responsibility, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a little of both, right? So I think it's worth thinking about. I actually had this discussion with my editor recently. There's, I think, rightly so, answers, that have to do with, what are algorithms doing? And, from my very unschooled perspective, these algorithms that kind of concentrate people in these little echo chambers of misinformation, I think that's obviously a problem socially and politically. I also think, the issue there is human desire, right? That you're wanting that on some level. The algorithm is just selling you a product, right? It's the company marketing stuff to you that you want, and the company is simply becoming better and better at guessing what you want. And there's a feedback loop there. Your desire is kind of constitutive of itself and begins to form, snowball in certain ways. It whets its own appetite. And that's a problem, but it's inherent. It's in us. The ghost is not in the machine. And so, I think multiple things need to happen at once. Obviously those content purveyors should be on some level held accountable for the content they feature. We've been trying to get around that for a long time. That's a, sort of ongoing legal issue is, if you're hosting very bad things, are you accountable for it in some kind of way? And I mean, I think there are, important social and political reasons to say yes, in certain instances at the very least. You want to be respectful of free speech. And therefore, I think, the most malleable element here in play is how individuals respond to the information they receive, how they reason politically. And one thing that I would take some heart in is people have never received information well, used it well. And desire has never been better or purer than it is now. And democracies have always been, such a beautiful idea. I mean, purely bedeviled by the fact that to govern the way you want, you would hope that people want good things, but they don't. They end up governing along the lines of their own desires. And, you get to see how it plays out, which I think is both good and bad, because human beings, I think, naturally desire the good. The heart falls in that direction. So that's why, democracies, including ours, you see a lot of good. Huge and not strictly self-interested effort to achieve a kind of common good. But people also, especially en masse, can get caught up in certain moods where they are not desiring the good. And those moods can have, lasting effects. So these 13 people who were just executed by the federal government, right? The federal death penalty wasn't even reinstated until 1988, and it was because Lynn Bias died of a crack overdose. And they decided to do a bunch of federal level crack legislation. So a basketball player dies of a drug overdose, obviously very sad. And a bunch of congressmen just get caught up in a mood. We have to reintroduce the federal death penalty in order to punish these drug crimes. That's exactly what happened. It happened with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, 1988. The 1986 version of that same law was introduced by none other than Joe Biden, who is now probably our best hope for abolishing the federal death penalty. So that's another aspect of politics that we have to deal with, is that people are susceptible to changing desires, and also they can kind of get each other spun up on stuff. And, it's an aspect of democracy we've always had to cope with, whether or not we have the information technology we do now. So there is accountability there, but I think there's also this kind of ongoing project of figuring out how humans can live together in peace, and nobody's come up with an answer that's, I think, 100% satisfactory.
Chesterton has this great discussion of how if you want to meet and interact with people who are different from you, go live in a small town. Because if you live in the city, what's going to happen is that you're going to find ways to affiliate with the people who are like you. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that is what happens in the internet and on social media. Everyone lives in a big city now, in the sense that everyone can find, right, those groups. And so these the echo chamber just becomes possible because this is what people in fact choose when they can choose, when they aren't forced to interact with the neighbor who is different from them. They don't choose to do so.
Yeah, it's interesting to me in that, God seems to want us to live in cities, right? City of God. He's interested in human cities, not like sort of nomadic or tiny outposts or even like sort of nuclear units, but all of the early Christians especially imagine a city, like a well-developed urban polis. And I'm like, oh, it's just a whole hell of a lot of problems we don't need. Why don't we just do cottagecore shit and imagine everybody living in their own little homestead? It seems a lot easier, but that doesn't seem to be what we're made for. It's just that we're not very good at being what we are. And so we end up in these weird hijinks, which, as sad as they are also really funny. People are mad at me on Twitter right now for making fun of the Cruella de Vil movie. She's a lady who skins puppies, and now she's like the sexy girl boss heroine of a Disney movie. You can't come up with anything more diabolical as a motive than like skinning puppies for fashion.
She's the heroine of the movie?
Yeah, this is part of that anti-heroine reboot cycle we're in. They did the same thing with the creature that was the bad guy. Okay, I don't really know what I'm talking about here. Angelina Jolie is involved, and I associate her as a monster with Grendel's mother from that weird Beowulf production. It was like mostly CGI, but also she is this Disney monster.
Yeah.
That's not Grendel's mother.
The mother of, I don't remember which one, Sleeping
Whatever.
Beauty or one of those other.
Okay, something like that. Yeah. So they're doing that now. And so now
I see.
all the female villains are going to get the big, rethink, the reboot treatment.
I see.
Which I find hilarious. And people were like, oh, well, why can't we have female villains? Is that sexist? I'm like, no, this is exactly reversing the circumstances that set this person up as a villain. You had a female villain, which is fine and good, and there should be more of that. Now you're taking that and doing a bunch of mitigation. Well, if you only understood where she came from, you'd be like, okay, skinning the puppies, I understand. I'm like, that is the opposite of what you want. You want her to be as irredeemable as any other villain, and if you want them all to be redeemable, that's fine. I agree with that. I think the best villains are, pretty much 49-51 with the hero. But now digressing.
Okay, we have to stop because we've gone over, but it's just been so much fun talking to you. Liz, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was really fun.
And thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, William. And Night Owls will be back next quarter. I don't actually know what we're doing yet, so just stay tuned on Twitter and I'll announce who's coming. Okay, bye everyone. Good night.
Thanks, guys.